I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the latest episode, number 37, in this podcast dedicated to the betterment of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. The guest we've got on this show is somebody that I've been wanting to get on for a long time. He's a very busy and popular man and a tough guy to get scheduled, but I'm so happy that we were able to finally get him cornered for an interview. This is Dr. David Nutt. He is currently the Edmund J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology and the head of the Center for Neuropsychopharmacology in the Division of Brain Sciences at the Imperial College London. He's also the president of the British Neuroscience Association, director of drug science, and vice president of the European Brain Council, and just has a ton of other research, writings, publications, and general psychopharmacological heroism to his credit. He's also something of a folk hero in the battle for rationality in drug laws and the laws for relating to what can and can't be studied. If you hang around until the end of this episode, we'll let you know something that you probably want to know if you don't about casual marijuana use for those of you who are looking to take advantage of some of the new U.S. laws related to now legalized marijuana, since that does relate somewhat to our interview subject. But before we get into any of that, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So according to a study that was presented on Saturday, May 3rd in Vancouver, British Columbia at the Pediatric Academic Sciences Annual Meeting, once again another tie to neuroscience in Canada, which seems to be a hotbed in my highly unscientific analysis, many Ivy League students do not view ADHD medication misuse as cheating. I guess that shouldn't be surprising, but some interesting results on this. At a highly competitive university, this was researchers analyzed opinions of 616 sophomores, juniors, and seniors without ADHD who completed this anonymous online questionnaire in December of 2012. Research showed that juniors reported the highest rate of stimulant misuse, that almost 70% of those who misuse stimulants did so to write an essay, some to study for an exam, and a few to actually take a test. More students who played a varsity sport and were affiliated with a Greek house reported stimulant misuse compared to students who were affiliated with only one of those or neither. And a third of students did not think that stimulant misuse for academic purposes was a form of cheating at all. 41% thought it was, and 25% were unsure. It's interesting to see how this perception is trending in society. I think cheating has to be considered very carefully because I would think what you're being tested on academically in the university is essentially like the end result is to give an accurate grade report so future employers can judge whether a person can perform like that. And really, there's nothing that would stop somebody from going out into the workforce and continuing to misuse stimulants, in which case the grade really is an accurate indicator of what they could be expected to do. And so cheating doesn't seem like it's misrepresenting what they're capable of. So even though it's definitely not necessarily the right biological choice to misuse stimulants, I don't think I would consider that cheating per se. Anyway, that's my vote. Also, quite pleased to report, picked up another 5-star review in iTunes this week by S. Black, who said, I was put off by this podcast at first because a lot of smart drug related information is biased, but this podcast is doing really well. I'm a neurograd student/geek, so I'm typically familiar with the research he talks about, and so far he's done a great job of factually conveying everything. Woohoo! I added the woohoo myself.
Smart Drug Smarts.
All right, so as mentioned, our main interview is Dr. and Professor David Nutt, currently of the Imperial College London, among other positions. Dr. Nutt was named to the position of chairman for the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs in the UK in 2008, and he'd been the chair of the technical committee for 7 years prior to that. He probably got his biggest spike of international renown and visibility, I guess, for the general public, when in 2009 he was sacked from that position, among controversy, basically because he had said that statistically taking ecstasy is no more dangerous and in fact is less dangerous than horseback riding. Anyway, we're going to talk about this in the coming interview, but I sort of wanted to give that as a little bit of background so you know some of the areas that we delve off into. With no further ado, Dr. David Nutt.
I mean, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a pharmacologist. All my professional career, I've been interested in how best to use drugs to improve psychiatric disorders and the human condition. I worked as the government's chief advisor on drug harms for 9 years. And during that time, it was absolutely clear to me that the processes being used to assess drug harms were absolutely arbitrary. They were unsystematic, non-transparent, and gave ridiculous results. So when I was working with the government, I brought in a series of new developments to standardize decision making, to have standardized ratings of different harms of different drugs, and also to properly to develop what I think is the best, most comprehensive set of metrics for measuring drug harms. And that was a process where eventually we worked out from bootstrapping. There were 16 different ways in which a drug can harm you, 9 harms to the user and 7 harms to society. Mm-hmm. And that all worked very well, and we worked through several iterations of those kind of analyses with the drugs we were having controlled and drugs which weren't controlled. That was where I first started getting into trouble with the government by insisting we looked at legal drugs like alcohol and tobacco in these assessments. And of course, then things got a little bit more problematic when the most sophisticated assessment published in The Lancet in 2010 showed actually that alcohol was the biggest problem, the most harmful drug in the UK.
I'm actually looking at that chart right now, and basically there's 3 really, really bad outliers according to this chart. They're on different parts of the chart as far as the harm to the user versus the harm to society. But crack cocaine, heroin, and alcohol are the 3 super, super bad ones, just according to the layout of the data.
That's right. And of course, the problems, alcohol is the big harms of alcohol come from its wide use in society. So although it's not the most harmful drug to the user, I think crack and heroin and crystal meth are more harmful, but because of its widespread use. I mean, in Britain today, alcohol is the leading cause of death in men between the ages of 16 and 54.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
It's denied. Anyway, put that to one side. So we came up with this very clear scale of harms and this relative harms of different drugs, and it showed that the drugs that governments like to get very upset about and focus on are relatively low in harm, like mushrooms and LSD and ecstasy. I mean, and I began to think that part of the reason governments were focusing on these was a deliberate an attempt to pretend they were doing something and avoid having to do something about alcohol. So I started agitating for basically a harm-based approach, and also to stop criminalizing people using drugs that are less harmful than alcohol, because that's a kind of rational choice. If you want to hit
right,
you go for cannabis or ecstasy, not alcohol. So that didn't endear me to the government. But then I started thinking a bit more about the problem. And part of the problem we have with drugs is that people don't know how harmful drugs are in relation to other things. So they think drugs are extremely harmful, and that's an impression which, of course, is encouraged by many of the media. The media love these scare stories. You had that great one, didn't you? You know, bath salts made me bite a man's face off. You know, well,
right. And it's funny. I mean, thinking about brain damage from drugs. Well, how much brain damage is there from like high school football or rugby and things like that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I mean, you guys know about the harms of professional footballing.
Yeah,
a vast amount of concussion and long-term brain damage. Rugby, I mean, rugby's an interesting comparison. It's certainly more dangerous to play rugby than to take ecstasy. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Yeah. Because rugby, particularly broken necks and occasional deaths. But of course, the most dangerous common sport is horse riding, and so I'll just tell you why I got into that. I mean,
please do. For an American audience, horse riding it's something we don't think of on a day-to-day basis, most of us. But yeah, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, well, it's a good job you don't. You can't believe. I think it's an amazing. I can't remember exactly, but I remember looking when I wrote this paper about comparing horse riding with ecstasy. I wrote it because I'd seen a patient who damaged her brain falling off her horse, and personality had changed, and she'd lost her job, and she'd lost her children and her husband, and she was so disinhibited through the brain damage. She sought help from me, and I treat adults with attention deficit disorder, and she had severe hyperactivity and attention deficit from the brain trauma. I actually treated her with amphetamine, an illegal drug, because it's the most powerful treatment for ADHD. And it helped a little bit, but it was never going to put back the dead brain. But it got me interested in the whole question of how harmful is horse riding. And when I started reading about it, I got really quite scared because my daughters were horse riding at the time. And I realized that, there's a lot of damage from horse riding that is kind of brushed under the carpet. And when I looked at the American data, it's thousands of people every year in America die from horse riding. Thousands.
Wow. Yeah. You never do hear about that. That's really interesting.
There's actually a deliberate suppression of these data. It used to be that there's there are many horse riding magazines, and they used to publish at the end of the year all the people that died. And they stopped doing that because it was putting people off riding.
Sure. Yeah, it seems like a pretty big inhibition.
Coroners won't, I collect coroners' reports on horse riding deaths, and they all say an unexplicable death or no rhyme or reason why this girl died. And they say, well, the reason she died is because a ton of horse fell on her when she was jumping over a fence and the horse tripped. Anyway, horse riding is more dangerous. If you go jumping, jumping over fences, it's much more dangerous to do that than to take an ecstasy tablet. And I thought that would be an important comparison. At least people get some sense of the real harm of ecstasy.
Right.
And but that did not go down well at all, because it turns out that people don't want to know the truth about harms. And more than that, and this is really perhaps the most important point, that people think that if something's illegal, you shouldn't compare it with illegal activities.
Right, because they're sort of conflating the morality of it versus just the raw numbers.
And that made me realize two things. It made me realize that politicians in particular cannot be rational about illegality. Many of them said to me, look, if it's illegal, then, we cannot think about it in the same way. You cannot compare an illegal activity with a legal one. And I would say, well, you've got to decide on what grounds to make it illegal. And they kept going around, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. And it made me realize that if something's illegal, people stop being rational about it.
Yeah, that's so Kafkaesque. I mean, because you can't have the dialogue anymore.
And that made me realize that I hadn't up to that point quite understood how destructive the drug laws were in the sense of criminalizing people. Because once you've criminalized a young person for using drugs, they become underclass.
Mm-hmm.
And we have 1 million young men in Britain who have got criminal records for possessing cannabis. And that criminal record will do much more damage to their lives because it precludes them from getting almost any kind of employment than the use of the drug. So it made me realize that the illegality in itself was a thing to avoid at all costs because it so distorts rational thinking. But also, it made me realize that the argument about drugs is not an argument about harm. Governments say they're trying to protect the public and the harms of drugs, but in fact, that's a smokescreen. They're really trying to play the harm card in order to avoid telling the truth, which is they are making a moral decision.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the basis for that is? Are they protecting financial interests? I mean, obviously, like the alcohol industry is a gargantuan industry worth, who knows how many tens of billions of pounds per year.
Yes.
Do you think it's tied up in,
It's the alcohol industry is extraordinarily powerful, rich. It's a lot of the dishonesty about, a lot of the hysteria about non-alcohol drugs other than alcohol, is fueled at arm's length by the drinks industry, because the drinks industry does not want competition. It wants to be the sole provider of brain intoxicants.
Right.
And it helped. So for instance, the drinks industry paid for billboards all over the country in the 1990s warning people off taking ecstasy. Those were paid for by the drinks industry because it was scared.
Boy. Yeah, that's trying to keep a monopoly. Makes sense.
Totally. But then, so they do it. There's a direct fueling of fear but there's also the fact that the drinks industry commandeers a lot of newspapers, and it also pays about 50% of our politicians get support from the drinks industry for their own personal expenses or for their offices. So they essentially control most of the decision making about drugs in this country.
Wow, yeah, that many politicians are getting money specifically from the industry. That makes it a really tough battle. I know that we could talk about this for a super long time, but I would love to go over into the actual science of some of the psychopharmacology work that you do. So I guess the whole problem with sort of the anti-experimental drug policy that we see in both your country and the U.S. is that if scientists aren't allowed to do research, then the public never really gets a chance to learn what it might be missing from some of these taboo substances. But what are some clues? I mean, tell us what you think might be waiting for us if we were able to get past some of these bureaucratic holdups.
Well, as I've written recently, the UN conventions and the way that they're enforced in most countries, the worst censorship of research for 400 years. It's outrageous. Almost every banned drug has therapeutic utility. The worst is cannabis, where there are about 100 active ingredients in the cannabis plant and virtually none of them have been taken to their optimal value as medicines. And they will have value in terms of pain, spasticity like THC, but also in terms of anxiety and sleep disorders and cancers and maybe many other disorders. And then there are psychedelics. The psychedelics we're developing as non-addictive treatments for addiction, radical alterations in the way people think about their relationship with drugs like alcohol.
Yeah, I remember reading that the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous was actually a giant proponent of LSD use to break people from the addictive cycle of alcohol.
Exactly. That's right. Absolutely. And of course, that's been written out of history.
Yeah.
But he got his insight, as many people have in their lives. Steve Jobs said LSD was one of the most profound influences on his life. LSD changes the way people think about their relationship to the world. And there are 6 trials of LSD and alcoholism, which have recently been analyzed in a modern statistical process called meta-analysis and published a couple of years ago. And the effect of that, of our LSD and alcoholism, is greater or as great as any treatment we currently have. But it's been denied people for 50 years just because the American government, the DEA and the CIA didn't want young Americans taking LSD and therefore choosing not to fight in Vietnam. And this everywhere you look, MDMA is a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. Psilocybin is a treatment for depression, OCD, cluster headaches. Even the more recent drugs like methadone, which was being developed as a treatment for addiction, has got banned. So almost all the well-known illegal drugs have therapeutic value, and it is denied to almost everyone in the world, except for cannabis now, which of course some of your states have actually shown some courage in actually opposing the federal ban.
Yeah, just a few of them. It seems like hopefully that's the beginning of a broader movement, but we'll see what happens there.
Oh, it will be, because what maybe what Americans don't fully appreciate is that your federal government has had an enormously controlling influence on international drug policy.
Oh, I think that we probably do appreciate that. I mean, because, unfortunately, the American policy tends to be because we give so much foreign aid and things like that, it can be the 800-pound gorilla in the way that a lot of the, other countries fall domino-wise.
Absolutely. But now Americans have stood up to their government. That's given a lot of courage to the rest of the world to do it. So those states which have kind of broken ranks and had allowed medicinal cannabis and now legal cannabis, they are changing the world. They're not just changing America.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see, a year or two out, statistically have car accident deaths in Colorado skyrocketed or things like that. And I don't think we're going to see that. And I think those statistics will be really telling once they're available.
They won't go up. No, they go down.
Yeah.
We have these data now. I mean, we don't have the data with legal cannabis, but the Colorado experiment with medicinal cannabis is fascinating because it showed a significant reduction in road traffic deaths from alcohol because people switch. And cannabis is safer. It's not safe to drive under cannabis, but basically people who are stoned either choose not to drive or they drive more carefully. So we've already got evidence that there are health benefits for switching from alcohol to cannabis.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the potential for different sorts of cognitive enhancements that might come. Specifically, I guess I'd be curious about your work and research into psilocybin and MDMA, and I guess the types of drugs that are going to give people a creative uptick. Obviously, in popular culture ever since the 1960s, there's a huge amount of anecdotal evidence about creativity enhancement. What's really going on within the brain that leads to the extra creativity that people see under psychedelics?
Well, it's not just psychedelics. Can I just say a word cannabis here?
Sure.
The first Europeans to use cannabis, the Dutch school of painters, Rembrandt used cannabis to improve his ability to understand color and depth. Those painters used it actively to try to make them better painters. And of course, jazz emerged as a novel form of music because many of the musicians, the black musicians particularly playing jazz, were stoned and they could break free from the sort of tram lines of conventional music notation. But putting cannabis to one side, what about the psychedelics and creativity? Well, they're almost never studied because, there have been a handful of studies in the last 50 years on psychedelics and brain function. But we've done several of them. And from our work, we think what is going on is that creativity comes from allowing the brain to break free from the normal processes, the normal, as I say, the sort of tram lines on which your brain has organized itself to work is
Mm-hmm.
pretty repetitive and pretty predicted. And that's because actually as you grow up, your first 20 and 15 years of your life is about making your brain do what society tells it. And the brain is a good learner. It learns to do that. And that in most societies, not all, but in our society, creativity is not seen as a major asset. And these drugs, they disrupt the uniform processing of the brain. They uncouple the parts of the brain which are normally overcoupled, and they allow the individual parts to do their own thing. And that means that the frontal cortex, which is where I think creativity comes from, starts to escape from the ropes it's been tied with, and so people can start to think differently and more creatively.
If you could do any study you wanted to right now, what would be your top pick?
The study I really would like to do would be to use LSD to treat addiction. I think the potential is so enormous that we should do that study. That is the study that addiction is the largest cause of disability in men in Europe. It's more disabling than heart disease now.
Mm-hmm.
And I would bet it's probably not far off the top in the US. And we have very few treatments, and the treatments are not that effective. So I think an LSD study to help people get out of craving addiction to heroin, crystal meth, crack cocaine would be the study I would do.
Is it your intuition that the reason that LSD could be helpful with addiction is for that same reason that we just talked about with creativity, exactly. How it's sort of decoupling things that your brain is just habitually used to doing in a rote behavior?
Exactly. Absolutely. I mean, and when you talk to people with addiction, they often say to you, "I don't even enjoy drinking. I just can't stop myself."
Wow.
The brain just makes them do it. They often find themselves in a bar drinking when they didn't even want to go to the bar because their brain is locked into a behavior pattern. And what I think LSD can do is, and psilocybin as well, can uncouple the brain. Now, what we don't know is it could just be that a period of just a few hours of uncoupling may actually allow the brain to reset back to where it was, or a bit, less in a less addicted state. It may be there's a physiological change in the brain that lasts forever.
Mm-hmm.
Or it might be that it's more psychological. It might be that people see a different world and they realize they have alternative choices. They don't have to keep drinking. They can see they can see an alternative scenario, an alternative future, and that may be why it works. Or it may be a bit of both. And that's, really interesting research question I'd like to explore.
Yeah, I feel like, at the risk of sounding sort of, mystical or woo-woo, like a lot of people's failures to get over, parts of their own life that they don't like are just failures of imagination. They really can't imagine their life being other than it is. And so they don't take the necessary steps to kind of, shunt themselves out of it.
Absolutely. And the point about psychedelics is that they force your brain for a short while to be different. You're outside the box for a while and you can see there's a world outside the box is different to the one you're in.
When I'm looking at the that scatter chart of the different drugs and various amounts of harm, even these ones that we're talking about kind of with positive terms now, mushrooms, LSD, ecstasy, things like that are on the lower end of the harm scale. What actually is going on that would account for that physical harm that you do see from the use of things like mushrooms and LSD?
Oh, okay. So why are there harms at all? Yeah. Well, so you notice you're looking at the blue and the red chart, are you?
This is a blue one. This is off, I believe, The Lancet.
Yeah. So
I'll link to this article in the podcast also.
So there are two. Are you looking at the bars, the blue bars and the red bars?
No, these are little blue diamonds. Is the
okay? I chart. So you've got the two. You've got the chart. So the two axes of the chart. One is harm to self, and one is harm to others. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's the chart you're looking at. Right. So you'll notice that for the drugs like mushrooms and LSD, most of the harm is to self. Right?
Yeah, 100% of it is to self. Or I guess LSD is just like maybe one tick above the zero line.
Okay, so it's harm to self. So the harms of these drugs, well, some people have bad trips. That isn't necessarily a bad thing because some people have bad trips and still find it really useful.
Right.
I mean, there are a lot of people who use Ibogaine for mind enhancement and for treatment of addiction, and they often say it's a horrible trip. It lasts for 24, 36 hours. It's a horrible experience, but they're better for it. But some people have bad trips, and they remember the bad trip, and they have flashbacks, and they feel scared about the bad trip.
Gotcha.
So you can't dismiss that. There's, not everyone gets a good time when they take psychedelics. People who have got psychotic propensities can get more psychotic when they take psychedelics. So those are the two main things. And of course, were you to go and drive a car when you were taking a psychedelic, so there are just a few examples of people coming to harm for doing things like driving or swimming or that if they take them.
I can think of like guys my dad's age or a little bit younger that were around during the 1960s when LSD was a lot more prevalent. Some of these guys were like described as like LSD zombies, like they'd just done way too much of this stuff and were never quite the same. But then you never know what else were they doing in addition to that? I mean, is there really such a thing as like the LSD zombie, or was that really they were probably doing who knows what else at the time?
Well, it's a really interesting question. We don't know because there was so much dishonesty about the harms of LSD that it's hard to know what the truth is.
And I guess that's the problem with these things being illegal is when you're getting them from a street source, it's like you never really know what you're getting.
Well, that is also true, although by and large, I think most LSD supplies are probably generally have been LSD. So could LSD cause some kind of long-term personality? Well, yes, I mean, I suppose it could. I mean, if you see the world is so pointless that you don't want to be part of it, you don't know. Maybe these people were just going in that direction anyway. And
right,
it's often a very it's one of the problems with drugs is that people like to have explanations for why things change in people they know. And the biggest, I'll give you the worst example is with cannabis and schizophrenia. A parent sees their child become psychotic and schizophrenic. It wants an explanation. It doesn't like the explanation that it's genetic.
Yeah.
It looks for some other reason. It looks for what the child has done. And because some scientists start saying cannabis causes schizophrenia, it's pretty likely that they think, could cannabis have caused schizophrenia in my son? Since at least half of all young male schizophrenics have smoked cannabis, they can say, my son smoked cannabis, and therefore he's become schizophrenic.
Yeah, we just did a episode a couple of weeks ago on correlation versus causation and how humans love to make up stories.
But we have to fight against it because for two reasons. The first is, if it's wrong, it's actually, but we pursue it. We're actually not pursuing other more credible explanations.
Sure.
But what's worse is that people start blaming the kid for being psychotic. If you hadn't taken cannabis, you wouldn't be psychotic. There's absolutely no evidence for that at all. But we see it, and that's terrible. And we see doctors blaming their patients for smoking cannabis and causing their own illness, and that is exactly the wrong thing.
Because that's not what they need to hear when they're dealing with all the rest of that.
No, and in fact, many cases, many people with psychosis and schizophrenia use cannabis because it's the only thing that helps them. Because the drugs we give them are so unpleasant that they use cannabis to deal with the drug side effects. And in fact, it's quite common. You talk to people with schizophrenia who smoke cannabis, and you say, why do you do it when it makes the voices louder? And they'll say, yeah, but they make them louder, but it allows me to think. Because what happens when you hear the voices is that your whole brain becomes locked into voice hearing mode. Mm-hmm. That's a very unpleasant thing to be. There's nothing else about listening to the voices. Cannabis allows you to detach. It's a bit like a psychedelic. It switches off the over-involvement in listening to the voices, and they can then think about other things. They can enjoy music. They can be detached for a period when they're stoned. So many people with schizophrenia get benefit from cannabis.
Right. Tell us about some of the projects that you're involved with now. You founded something called Drug Science. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so Drug Science is a charity that it's been set up to essentially gather evidence about drugs, the harms, the benefits, and tell the truth about that evidence on our website. So you go on our website, drugscience.org.uk, and it is I think the only truly independent source of information about drugs that exists in the world. Most governments have their drug information sites, and you have a very good one from NIDA in America, but it's always contaminated by government pressure. We don't get any funding from government. We don't get any funding from people that make drugs or sell drugs. We're just a group of experienced, concerned scientists who just want to have the truth out there. So that's what I'm doing. A lot of what I'm doing is now making us the go-to. I think in Britain now, probably any journalist that wants to find out what's going on with a drug comes to us because it knows we'll tell it straight. We've become an enormously vital resource to the media as well as to parents and also and young people who want to know what's going on. If they're being peer pressured to use a drug, they can come to our website and find out exactly what they need to know.
Yeah, do a real cost-benefit analysis.
Absolutely. And then challenge the people that are perhaps misinformed and trying to encourage them to do something they don't want to do.
Do you have anything to say, any thoughts on, sort of the nootropic drugs that are out there, the people that are taking specifically for, cognitive enhancement?
Yeah, I mean, I've done quite a lot of thinking about this over the years and a bit of writing about it. I mean, I think the problem is we don't really have any evidence that they are useful unless you've got a problem. I mean, so unquestionably, if you've got ADHD, stimulants are effective. They can be life transforming. But for most of us, I think that the human brain's pretty clever and pretty efficient, and it's quite hard to make it more efficient. What you can do, obviously, is if you want to work for longer and stay awake for longer, you can take a stimulant to keep you awake.
Sure.
If you want to be more creative, then you can take a bit of cannabis. If you're going to sort of start creating music or painting, you could potentially, use psychedelics, I suppose, if you wanted to try to solve problems that you've got. I mean, I'm fascinated. I don't know if you've come across this man, Kary Mullis. Have you ever heard of him?
I think I have heard, Kary Mullis.
So Kary Mullis is an American biochemist.
A scientist, right? Yeah.
He won the Nobel Prize. So this is the guy that worked out how you could decode DNA rapidly.
Okay.
And he developed a technique called the PCR, the polymerase.
Oh, yeah, chain reaction, right. Okay.
And that is what everything in life sciences uses that. So when you want to find out whether your burger has got horse meat in it, they do a PCR on your burger, and if there's horse meat, there's horse DNA, and we can identify the fact that your burger is not pure.
Yeah, I remember being in high school when polymerase chain reaction was kind of the new thing, and all of a sudden they were just able to double quantities of DNA ad infinitum, and it really led to a revolution.
And he got the Nobel Prize, but he said, I saw that reaction on an LSD trip. I was driving down the freeway in San Diego, and I saw the DNA unraveling in front of me. And I went away and did the experiment, and it worked. So he's a total enthusiast for the use of psychedelics to crack hard scientific problems. And you use this quote from Einstein. Well, I use a quote from Einstein to explain it. Einstein said, "No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it."
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there may be real utility in the careful use of psychedelics to help people deal with seriously difficult problems, whether they're scientific or whether they're personal.
Thank you so much to Dr. David Nutt for joining us for that interview. Really interesting stuff, and I just think that guy's doing great work. You can probably tell he's a little bit of a hero to me as far as the conjunction of his interests with science and rationality and sticking it to the man where appropriate, and a heck of a nice guy. So I was really happy to have him on the show. Now, as an interesting counterpoint, or maybe not a counterpoint, but just something to bear in mind, as promised in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick, something about marijuana that might strike a little fear.
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So an article recently published on healthline.com states that even casual marijuana smokers are at risk for structural brain changes. So most of the studies on marijuana use for recreational users have been kind of people that are using it pretty heavily, kind of like everyday smokers and stuff like that. But that doesn't really fit the profile of the majority of people who are recreationally using pot. Most people are kind of, maybe the once a week, twice a week, every other week sort of crowd. And there hasn't been a heck of a lot of research into what that level of marijuana use is really doing to people neurologically. Turns out that according to this latest study, there's sort of a linear progression. I mean, maybe not strictly linear, but the more that you smoke, the more that your brain changes. It's not like there's an instant spike up at some danger threshold. Dr. Hans Breiter says this study raises a strong challenge to the idea that casual marijuana use isn't associated with bad consequences. Now, what they didn't do in this study is really define what bad is, but they are looking at physical changes in brain structures, which you generally don't want to have. I mean, you have to assume that Mother Nature has fine-tuned our brain to be structured relatively well, and changes are generally going to be a bad thing to that master plan. The main change noted is that the nucleus accumbens, a part of the brain linked to reward processing, was larger and had changed shape in casual smokers compared to non-users. Researchers also found that the amygdala, which helps to regulate emotions, has changed in shape and density in those who smoked the drug. The more marijuana that users had ingested, the more abnormalities the scientists detected in their brain scans. This study suggests that even light to moderate recreational marijuana use can cause changes in brain anatomy, said Dr. Karl Lupica. So bear all this in mind when making the decision on whether to trade in that glass of wine for a now legalized joint if you're in Colorado, or whether you just want to pop some fish oil and some caffeine and maybe a little paracetam and call it a smart drugsy day. So you heard it. That is the episode. If you liked what you heard, please recommend this podcast to your friends and leave us a review on iTunes. And if you thought that I was excessively perky, I should give a standing round of applause to a place called The Blue Fig on about 21st Street and Valencia in San Francisco. If you're there, that place makes a very, very strong cup of coffee. I'm a pretty big coffee drinker, but this cup of coffee was more than I bargained for. So anyway, those of you who like caffeine in what I expect is a shockingly large quantity and happen to be rolling through San Francisco might want to check this place out. The show notes for this episode will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to all the stuff we talked about here. I'll be back at you next week, right here on smartdrugsmarts.com, with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smart podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smart should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.